All right, it's 6:30 on the button, and we'll assemble ourselves, and we'll get ready for our community information session. So thank you for everybody coming out, and this is a real good crowd. I counted about maybe 30, 35 or more. Remember, give your name to Josh. He's going to be taking your name, and we'll be making some draws at the end of the evening for some gift certificates. We have about 15 people on the line already. And given that we've already had something to eat, and we have a lot of guests here tonight, I don't know who they are. So I'm gonna, in just a bit, I'm going to let the chief introduce them. But tonight, this is the format, unlike some of the other nights. The other nights was we had a good, healthy discussion. Okay, those were looking at the program, some of the delivery, and we were able to question this. Tonight, what we're looking at is an information session. Okay, these aren't the ones that deliver the actual program, and so they're laying the information or the groundwork for what we're doing actual on the ground. So tomorrow night, that's when we're going back to the information sessions of the people that we have operating here under reserve. So tonight, we're not stopping the questioning, but we're looking at the information being provided. Tomorrow night, we look at the actual operations and practice. That's what how I believe it is. So as we carry on the evening, and we start right now, I'll let the chief introduce all of these guests that we have here today. We're going to have a presentation by Cindy Blackstock following. There you go.
Thank you very much, Terrence. First of all, what an amazing meal again tonight. Let's give a round of applause to all the cooks and the ability to have a good meal together. I'd also like to acknowledge George and the prayer that he gave this evening, not only for the meal, but also for a good evening for us. So thank you very much for doing that for us. Give him a round of applause. Powwow season's coming up pretty darn quick, so we know that he's going to be darn busy. And always looking for volunteers for the powwow committee as well, just to put that shout out for you there, George. As Terrence said, thank you very much for that introduction, Terrence. And as you stated, tonight is a little bit of a different format in the sense that it's more for information gathering from the circle of support, and they don't like being called experts, but the circle of support that we have utilized, part of the circle of support that we have utilized as your governance team in reviewing the fiscal as well as coordination agreement for C92, the structure of it, as well as the Meal Pamatswin Act and all of the provisions within that, which also includes the Eagle Women's Tribunal. And we've had a very interesting journey to get here. And you know, there's been some struggles, like everything that is new. Everything that is new is always filled with lessons learned. And that is definitely what we have taken as your governance team, is the lessons that we needed to learn and the strengths that we could stand on and the teachings that we can follow in order to do the job that we need to do as your governance team on behalf of all of us, for those children who are most vulnerable, our families who are most vulnerable, and especially for those yet unborn. We expect, and our prayer has always been that when we leave these positions, the ones that take our place, because healthy children, families, our community, our nation, there will never be an end date as long as there's one Cowessess person alive. So we know that we are part of a continuum, and our job is to leave something better off than what we had found it. And that is our commitment to you. I would like to acknowledge, before I introduce our guest speakers, I would like to acknowledge our council members who are here, who are the interim board of directors for Chief Red Bear Children's Lodge. We have first Councillor Terry Lara. And I'm just quickly looking around here. We have Councillor Ira Sagan. And Councillor Malcolm, it will be here. He has a couple of things that he has to do before he gets here tonight, but he said, don't worry, the man, the myth, the legend will be here as soon as he can. So he did want me to share with that. When we came in and we saw that we had a very, very serious task in front of us, which was basically, we had a deadline coming up as soon as we got into office on an extension agreement and a successor agreement to the C92. We immediately knew that we had a huge learning curve in front of us, and that not only did we have to have certain members of our governance team, but we also had to work with the people who were already on the ground in our community, and also surround ourselves with people who, with their lived experience, with their educational experience, and with their knowledge of indigenous worldview on how to advise us to do the best job that we can. And the counselors that stood up and bravely put their thinking and their learning hats on became the task team. And I would like to introduce, first of all, Councillor Curtis Delorme. Get up here, Curtis. We're going to be sitting up here. Councillor Allison Whiteman. And Councillor Brandon Pelche. And everybody give him a dirty look every time he tries to watch his game on his phone. Even though he believes it, they will win or lose regardless if you're watching. I don't even know which team that he likes, so. What's that? Pittsburgh? Oh, Pittsburgh. And they're not even Canadian. What's going on with that? Oh, the captain is, okay. Oh, he's transferred to Cowessess. Oh, there goes I told you guys I have 1 week joke a night. Come on, that was it. That was the attempt. We invited, shortly after we began, like I said, what we wanted to do was surround ourselves with people that were much smarter and knowledgeable than us. And we were so fortunate and blessed to have an incredible group of people of national, I guess, acclaim, if you will, because of their incredible hard work and dedication to our children and families. And oh, Joshua, sorry, Joshua Sagan. My apology. Give him a double round of applause. You know, and a speech. And also, he's taking bribes because he's the one that's getting everybody's names down for the door prizes, just to let you know. And I think his team might be playing his team. No? Oh, they're still good? Okay. Okay, just I'm a nerd. I have nothing about hockey. Okay, so in our very serious quest for knowledge, the knowledge that we required in a very short amount of time, we were very blessed to have, like I said, people come forward and to share their knowledge. And 2 of those people are here with us tonight. And we have a shero and a hero, if you will. And they have always wanted us to know, and in their deliberations and discussions with us have always said what we bring to the table is only for you as Cowessess to contemplate, to understand that this is our experience and that we are there for Cowessess and whatever you need from us. But this is for Cowessess, and this is what Cowessess is doing. This is not about what we want to do for Cowessess. And so we really want to stress that, because we don't want any of our community thinking or believing that we have the people that we've brought in are doing either the work for us or bringing forth ideas or philosophies that our own people will not put in, that our people will put into our fiscal and coordination agreement, as well as program models, and as well as the programs and services that we at Cowessess have, because we are responsible for them. And on the road to sovereignty, it is with their ability to teach and to listen and to learn from all of us together that we're putting the package together with the people that are on the ground in order to put those program models together, our own laws, our own legislation, and in order to have them developed, implemented, and enforced, and to be enforceable, as well as to know that they're evergreen, which is always alive. And so that there are always places and areas that we know that we will always, as we know better, we will do better. And that is on behalf of our children. So we have two guest speakers tonight, and I'm really bad at introducing them, and they're better at introducing themselves. First, we're going to have Dr. Cindy Blackstock, and next we're going to have Andre Bear. And they're going to speak on two different aspects of what we are doing. The first one is to discuss C92 and what it is, as well as Jordan's principle, and how that all relates to not only on a national level, because we're all connected and we're all kin as Indigenous people across Turtle Island, but also how it relates to Cowessess First Nation. And after Dr. Blackstock is finished, Andre Bear is going to be talking about his experiences, as well as what he has assisted nations in doing in contemplating sovereignty as well as nationhood, and how our laws are put together and how to make them our laws. And we're very excited to have both of them, and we're so blessed to have them in the 2 days of a think tank session. So today was day one, and tomorrow is day two, where we'll also have a couple of other guests. We did have Mary TG, who is an absolute incredible source of information, and just she's a shero too. And she was with us all day today via Zoom. She had planned to come to our nation, but they had an elder pass away, and so she was unable to make it. And tomorrow we're going to have Dr. Helena Gaspar, who is very much known for assisting us with our court cases and challenges on the rights of our children, as well as what they deserve and what our nations deserve in order to be properly funded. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Cindy Blackstock to present to us this evening.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Council. What an honor to be here at Cowessess. You know, I've really enjoyed being here. And I'm excited that all of you have welcomed this Gitxsan girl into Cree territory. You know, we hear there a lot about jurisdiction. And, you know, that word has been floating around for a long time. It sounds like something that you can just do, right? But what I've learned is it's kind of like having a baby. You know, when you have your first baby, you think, well, how hard can it be? right? And then the next day after you have the baby, you think, oh my God, am I ever going to sleep a wink a night, right? But the joy that comes from actually those difficult moments of trying to find out where you're going to go, how you're going to do things in the best way possible, that's part of the journey. That's part of doing jurisdiction. And that's the most important thing. It can't just be a romantic idea that floats up in the air and that people talk about. It has to be that hard and sacred work. And that's why I find it such a privilege to sit around the table with all of you, because you're willing to do that. So Corey's going to help me out with my slides, and we're going to go to the next one. So one of the elders that's been a blessing in my life is the late Elmer Corshane. And I don't know if many of you know him, but he would always say to me, he said, you know, Cindy, when you're looking at what's good for First Nations children, you can't just talk about justice. You have to talk about loving justice. Because children need loving justice. That means that we have to ask more of ourselves than we ever thought we could before. And we have to conduct ourselves in a way that brings honor and dignity to them and respects the fact that they're the closest to the Creator. And we have to look to them as being our teachers. And most importantly, we always have to see them. It's so easy as adults to think you're working with children, but then you don't think, well, what is my idea going to look like for that child? Is their life going to be changed in a better way for them and their families because we're doing things in this way? And so loving justice is something that I always try to strive for in my own work. And one of the things to talk about nationally is when we talk about child and family services, what are some of the key facts? Well, what we know is that 72% of children in care nationally who are First Nations are actually off reserve. So this is important when you're thinking about jurisdiction, because you want to be able to look after those children. But sometimes some of those children, because of colonization, are maybe over in another province or even in another country with the United States. So we have to be realistic about what we can do, but where we need to enter into partnerships with others to be able to do it. The other thing is that First Nations kids are overrepresented in child welfare at 17 times the rate of other kids. And the big reasons for that are the collective trauma from colonialism, which is meant to addictions, domestic violence, poverty, poor housing. All those things come together and they put families at risk, and therefore children are more likely to be in child welfare. But there's something really important when we think about those factors, right? When we think about poverty and poor housing and addictions and collective trauma, we can already see that child welfare is part of the solution, but it's not the solution on its own. And we were talking about that today, that we need everybody in the whole community to be working on this together. And we need to hold our federal and provincial governments' feet to the fire so that the services and supports are there for everybody, right? It's really, really key. So we'll go to the next slide, Corey. So this act appears, right? And as a government act, the federal government came into power. And I should say that at the time when they did this, we were so inspired by Colin Rope's work. I know that many of you know Colin here in Saskatchewan, and he was working with Raymond Shingoose, and they did so much work on jurisdiction and honoring those laws. And so we at a national level were working to create a First Nations law. A First Nations law act that would enable our First Nations legislation that would include things like Jordan's Principle, which we'll talk about later. The feds, though, came in with this act and they said, no First Nations specific act. We're going to bring one in on child and family services for Inuit, Métis, and First Nations. Everybody's going to be together. That was the federal thing. So this piece of legislation does a couple of things. First of all, it sets national standards that everybody, no matter who you are, delivering child and family have to follow. The province of Saskatchewan has to follow it. First Nations agencies in Saskatchewan have to follow it. And even if you have your own jurisdiction, you got to meet these national standards. What are they? Well, cultural continuity, right? making sure that kids have access to their culture and are able to practice it. This thing called substantive equality, which we're going to talk about in a minute, but basically you have to treat them fairly and without any discrimination. You have to look at the best interests of the child. And that's a tricky one, that best interest, because residential schools were operated allegedly under that banner, right? But we need to make sure that what we're talking about is best interests as you would see best interests of your children. That's really important. The other thing it does is creates a pathway for jurisdiction. Now, they aren't giving us jurisdiction because we've always had the jurisdiction, but they are affirming it. But what we need to be aware of is that they will fund it through another mechanism. So sometimes governments say, oh yeah, you can have self-government in this, but I'm only going to fund you at half of what you actually need to make your laws real. And that's something that we're really concerned about. We want to make sure the resources are there to meet the family's needs so the law can flourish, right? That's got to be together. The government always like to say, well, jurisdiction and then funding will come later. No, 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 that's a trap. Funding and jurisdiction have to come together as one. But no matter what you do under this act, everybody has to follow the Canadian Human Rights Act. And that's a pretty okay one for most First Nations, because it just means you can't discriminate against people because of their gender, disability, or other things. So that is something that no matter what law you have, you can't discriminate on those things. And the Charter of Rights and Freedoms still applies to your laws. Now, there's a couple cases going through the Supreme Court, and Andre here, who's actually a real lawyer, I just dabble in the law. We have actually another lawyer here, Scott. So there's some people who actually know the law. But the Supreme Court is really exploring how much that charter will affect our laws, right? But it's a mainstream thing and it has power. Next slide, please, Corey. So when I think I did frontline child protection, I just want to really honor all the people on the front lines working with community members. That was the hardest job I ever had, but probably the most sacred job I ever had. It was an absolute privilege. But you're dealing every day with people who have had a really hard time in their lives, and it can be really difficult work. But when we think about child and family services, I often say to people, I say, you know, I'm not sure child welfare is a real problem. I think the real problem are these things like the poverty and the poor housing and the trauma and the addictions. And if we need to get at those things, and those are called the drivers of child maltreatment, almost like a forest fire, right? We need to put it out. We need to put out the fire. We need to be able to do all that preventative work we had in our traditions so that we didn't get these big mega fires when they happen, right? And these same fires, by the way, these drivers, that's the same problems we have with young people getting in contact with juvenile justice, right? Same factors are at play there. When we have young people who are struggling with their mental health, it's the same stuff. So if we get at these big problems and we can make a difference across a whole pile of areas. We need to stop Canada's discrimination. Canada funds on reserve child welfare, and they fund Jordan's Principle on and off. We need to make sure the federal government is honoring First Nations children. But that in alone, it was not enough because the federal government does not fund child welfare off reserve. The provinces do. And you live in one whopper of a province. Not in terms of your territory, but in terms of the Saskatchewan government, right? Just to be clear. So that's a tough nut to crack, right? And we need to, in this work, be accountable to children and young people themselves. You know, if we were to go and talk to young people, are their lives better today than they were yesterday because of all the work we're doing? And if not, then we need to rechange what we're doing so we are making that difference, right? It's not about being right. It's about doing right, right? Next slide, Corey. So when I think about jurisdiction, I think, okay, of all these problems we talked about, which ones can it solve? Well, one of the big ones I think I'd like to target is the definition of neglect. Now, I did frontline work for about 15 years, and I've been doing this for about 40 now. I just met a fellow wood dragon in the group. We're in the same year, 1964. Yeah, yeah, this is our year this year. So when you think about that, then what are the things that jurisdictions do? Well, the most frequent reason why First Nations youth go into care is neglect. But what does that actually mean? In the law, it says you are unwilling or unable to care for your child. But that assumes that you have the culturally based services to be able to, address your challenges that you're having in your family, right? And that those services are available. You don't have to be on a 12-month wait list to get into addictions treatment or things like this, right? So I think that when I was doing child welfare, I'd really try to hold people's feet to the fire for things they can change, right? Because every time there's things that we can do and we have to take responsibility for. But I also wanted to hold the system's feet to the fire for things that are beyond the ability of parents to control. So I think paying attention to the definition of neglect is a big one. The other thing you can do is ingrain your cultural teachings and a more of a holistic kind of approach for child welfare into the law. So it is dealing with all these big problems like addictions, collective trauma, and everything else, right? And put in words like love into your law, right? You know, that word is missing from every provincial child welfare statute that I can think of. And yet it's one of the number one things that every kid needs in their life, right? That and a bit of fun, right? Okay, so next slide. So what problems can communities solve? Well, actually, there's quite a bit, right? Sometimes we feel like we've been disempowered because we don't know what to do. But if we're really going to take on self-government, that means we have to embrace what hurts in our own lives, in our families' lives, in my case, in our houses' lives, and in our communities' lives. This usually comes down to this, like if you see something that's happening for a kid that's not right, and you say to your friend, well, somebody needs to say something. Well, self-government is that somebody is you, right? That's really when we're getting there, right? When we say someone needs to do somebody, well, that somebody is going to be you. That's self-determination right there, right? That's how we really reclaim those roles. And we show our kids that we love them, right? We show them that we love them even when we're scared sometimes of doing the right thing. So a lot of this stuff, when you think about your vision of what a healthy Cowessess child is, actually is probably a lot more than you think about what you can do in your community that doesn't require any other government to say yes or no and doesn't require any money, right? So these are important ingredients of this self-determination thing. And you've got leaders here who are doing their part of the share of the work, but everybody in the has to be a leader for a kid, right? Next slide. So now we're kind of getting into my bailiwick, which is this one area of trying to get kids being treated fairly. And this is where we come down to this law, this thing in the act about substantive equality. So the difference between straight up equality and substantive equality is if we think about the non-Indigenous population, they never went through residential schools. They didn't have their land taken from them. They didn't have the Indian Act. They didn't have their cultures and everything else taken from them. And if you say, well, you know, we're going to give the First Nations folks the same thing that the non-Indigenous folks did, that's not fair, right? Because we've had all those things. And so substantive equality would mean that a First Nations child would get more to get them at the same opportunities to succeed, right? So with our bear picture there, equality actually is unfair, right? It's the equal treatment of unequals. What we want to make sure is our kids can reach those branches and climb that tree, right? That's what we want. This is such an important thing. In social work, it's the closest thing we have to a major silver bullet. The more it turns out, the more fair you treat people, the more dignified their lives can be, and the better off they are and the whole community is. This is really important. Next slide. So what problems? Well, it can get at those fires we talked about, the poverty, the addictions, the collective trauma. And they can also do things like reduce coronary heart disease, diabetes, it'll improve your economy. It improves education outcomes for kids. All these things from just doing that one thing of reducing the inequalities and treat kids and families with dignity. So it's a really important principle. Next slide, please. So we get to the tribunal case. So what is this thing? Well, we filed it in 2007 with the authority of all the First Nations leadership across the country, along with the Assembly of First Nations. We brought it to the tribunal and we said, Canada, you are racially discriminating against First Nations kids by underfunding child welfare. And what was happening on the ground, if you were around then, and some of you might have been, was anybody doing child welfare up before 2016? Quite a few of you probably were. Hey, there you are. All right. Well, the most you would have gotten in Cowessess for prevention, for help for families, would have been $35,000 per year before then. That was it. So you can imagine trying, if you were in charge of all the families in Cowessess and you were trying to help families overcome all the trauma and you had $35,000 to deal with it. That's what you had. That's what we were trying to fix. And then also Jordan's principle, to make sure that children had access to health, education, and social supports they need when they need them. Because child welfare on its own is not going to fix everything. So that's what it's about. We need to stop the discrimination from Canada. And here's the biggie ticket item. We need to make sure Canada doesn't do it again. And Canada is a repeat offender, right? Residential schools, oh, we're sorry about that one. Then the 60s group, oh, we did it again, sorry. And now this. And so we have to try and use this legal mechanism that we have Canada in front of right now to make sure it doesn't happen again. Next slide. So what do we all got together? This case was filed in 2007. And I'll tell you, when we filed this thing, I thought, okay, this BC girl's going to move out to Ottawa for 3 years. This thing's going to be fixed and I'm going to go back to BC. And it's been over 20 years later, right? Because actually it takes a while for the feds to kind of sort themselves out, right? But together, all of us working together, we've had over 4 million services and products go to First Nations kids through Jordan's principle. We've had over $20 billion in different types of family supports go out to families all over the country. And we're not done yet, right? We're not done because our kids deserve every penny of that. It's not just the level of the money, it's the way that we structure it so that it goes to kids, right? If people are having the debate, oh, well, it should go to this group or this group, that's the wrong conversation. The money should go to the group that's the best positioned to meet that child's needs today. That's where it should go, right? So next slide, Corey. So when we're in a legal proceeding, you know how sometimes you just got to sit down with government and negotiate something, keep your fingers and toes crossed. Well, we could do that, but that means they have to agree to it. So that's one way of solving this problem. The second one is we forget about talking to Canada. We'll just go to the tribunal and put in our submissions and let the tribunal decide. Or we could do a combination of both. I think it's going to be a combination of both to be able to achieve the goal of stopping the discrimination and preventing it from happening again, both in child and family and Jordan's principle. I'm not prepared personally to just go with whatever Canada will agree with, because Canada never agrees to very much for our kids. We've had 24 non-compliance orders in this case. If we had agreed with what Canada was willing to do, there would have been no Jordan's principle services, other than for a very small group of children who had short-term illnesses. That was it. If we would have agreed only with what Canada was willing to do, there would be no Jordan's principle off reserve. There'd be no capital. There would have been no funding for prevention services above just $72 million they were prepared to throw at it. So we have to use this as an opportunity to put our best solutions forward and get the tribunal to order it, right? That's what we should be doing, I think. So next slide. I'm not going to go through all this, but to say that the landscape of people who are actually delivering child and family has changed quite a bit since 2016. And that's a good thing, right? Before then, you had to have a provincially delegated agency if you're a First Nation, and that was it. And provincially delegated agencies do some incredible work. If we look at the data, we can see that provincially delegated agencies, even though they were underfunded at that $35,000 per year, they were twice as likely to keep a child in their community than a non-Indigenous agency was. So we have to give credit where credit is due. Could have they done more? Absolutely. And that's why we needed to get them the resources to be able to do it. But now we have C92, we have some First Nations delivering prevention. There's other people in the picture. Next slide. And our position at the Caring Societies, we want all those people to have the adequate resources to meet the child's needs. But if there's multiple people in a community delivering services, they all need to be coordinated. Because kids don't separate themselves into education, health, child welfare. They're one person. And so we as adults who are looking after them have to have holistic ways of working together to make that happen. Now, this slide is probably the most boring in my presentation, but one of the most important. When you're trying to hold the federal government accountable, you have to use a funding structure. What do I mean about that? This money is structured in this way to meet these needs with children. Why is this thing important? Because you can enforce it in court if the government backslides. So Helena Gaspard, who is going to be joining the gathering tomorrow, she has been working on this, and this is based on First Nations and First Nations Child Welfare Agency data. So we're on the breach of success, but here's the trick. My nephew is a heavy-duty mechanic. Anybody here like cars? Yeah, I don't know almost nothing about them, but I do know this. If I take the carburetor out of the car, it's not going to run. It's the same thing with these funding structures. They have to move together. If you start as some kind of amateur saying, oh, well, we'll just give that piece over here, it can actually really make the car not run. And who doesn't run for? The children. That's the problem with it. So I just wanted to kind of show you what it looks like, and we'll skip on to the next slide. So the other thing is that these funding structures, when they're done, it's not enough for them to just say, oh, well, in Canada, there's going to be X billion dollars. You need to know what that looks like for Cowessess, right? You need to be able to say, what does this look like for our community? So we can test it and see if it's right for us. And that information is available for the community and has been provided, which is a good thing. Next slide. So I want to get to these kids off reserve because I keep on thinking about them. Likely going to have to take on the Saskatchewan government, right? Because we can't have a situation where nations who are doing the good work of jurisdiction end up discriminating against their own kids because the off reserve is underfunded. Sometimes you'll have sibling groups, right? I know I work with sibling groups where I had a brother and sister, and one of them was removed on reserve and got federally funded, and then one of them was off reserve and got provincially funded, and they were treated differently because of that, right? That's ridiculous, right? So we have to create pathways so that all the children receive the type of quality help we want to give to kids. That's going to be important. And it's not just Saskatchewan, it's all the provinces will need to come up to the plate on this. And they need to adopt Jordan's principle too, right? The provinces do, so that that's available through the provincial services too. All right, next slide, please. So I want to talk to you about one of my most favorite and sacred things. In my office, if you walk in and you're all invited to our office, we have a dog. Her name is Sunny, so you can come and see her. Andre is in love with Sunny. And it's also where Spirit Bear lives. If you walk into our office, one of the first things you're going to see is Jordan River Anderson's baby blanket. And that was gifted to us from the family to remind us of the sacredness of Jordan's principle. And I would always ask people, some people I hear say the word JP, please do not. Say his full name and honor his spirit of this little child. And so his name is Jordan River Anderson. He's actually named after the River Jordan, the sacred river. And I think in so many ways that was just the perfect name for this little boy who, you know, crossed rivers that the government never did in 150 years. It's kids before governments, right? Sometimes, like we have to, if we're going to be doing jurisdiction, or if you're a federal government, you got to put the kids first. Figure out the adult stuff later about who pays for it, right? It covers health, education, and social services. But it does require a note if it's a cultural item from a knowledge keeper or elder from the community, or a professional note, say from a teacher if it's a learning assessment, or a doctor. And the reason we have that is we wanted to make Jordan's principle was really honored. And we didn't want to see it being used in ways that just weren't kind of living up to the spirit of Jordan's principle. And it got to the people both need. And it also needs the guardian's consent, right? For the child, right? We don't want to be putting your kid through x-rays and you don't know about it. That's right. Next slide. I want to just honor his family. These are two of his sisters. And I want to pay my respects to Peter Ballantyne First Nation, because that's where Jordan's mom is from. Virginia Ballantyne. So, you know, they've been so generous and great advocates of Jordan's principle. I know they were here in Saskatoon just a few weeks ago. And I always like to pay my respects to their family. Next slide. So when we look at Jordan's principle, now we've had a few years of experience with it. What are we finding out? Well, it's plugging holes in other underfunded federal programs on reserve. Education. Does this sound familiar? Medical transportation, services for children with special needs. And the solution for that is to actually fund those other programs properly, right? That's what we say the solution is. And we're also seeing different rates of compliance from the federal government. So if you're in Quebec, you're actually getting really good access. But if you are in Ontario or Saskatchewan, things are a bit rockier, right? So this report is available on the IFSD website, so you can watch it. Next slide, please, Corey. I'm just watching the time because I want to make sure you have time to speak for on. He's disappeared. He's given up hope that I'll ever stop. So because Jordan's principle is sacred to us, we've actually brought another non-compliance order against the government for Jordan's principle, because we've seen the government is not respecting Jordan's principle. There are thousands of cases, requests that the government has not even opened. I believe here in Saskatchewan it's like 4,000 are just sitting there, and we don't know what the needs are of those children, and they deserve to be determined within 48 hours. Or if it's a group case, within 7 days. And we've seen the tragedies that unfold when children's needs don't get met. You know, we've had women who have courageously fled domestic violence and needed supports for their children so they can set up a new lives for themselves. Well, they can't wait 3 or 4 weeks for the department to get a hold of them so they can do that. We've had children being denied life-saving treatments. So we brought a non-compliance order in front of the tribunal. This is all public. And I want to thank Cowessess First Nation for supporting that through a BCR resolution from your council. So thank you so much, because that really makes a difference for us. We really appreciate it. So this thing is winding its way through the courts, and I'm really feeling really confident that the kids are going to win this because the facts are there. And the tribunal has been pretty successful at getting the government on course again after they get found non-compliant. Next slide, please. So the hearing was scheduled for June 3rd and 4th, but it's been postponed now. So hopefully it will be in August. And APTN and the National Film Board, Ellen Isobamsawin, they will both be there filming it. So my hope is you're going to be able to watch it from webcast. You can even have like a viewing party right here at the hall, right? And watch us all argue this thing. Because I really think it's important we're accountable to you, right? Like we're doing stuff at that national level that's going to impact your kids. And so I want to be accountable. If I'm doing something that's stupid, I want to know about it because I want your kids to be good, and I want to make sure we're doing the right thing. Next slide. So because we brought that non-compliance of ocean, we were a part of that negotiation process to hopefully get agreement with Canada, but we had to step outside of that because there was a clause in that agreement that said, you cannot bring any non-compliance orders against Canada if you're going to be negotiating with Canada. And I thought, well, you know, I cannot stay in a negotiating space with Canada to end discrimination while they're discriminating, right? So we're out. Next slide. That's a good thing about the Caring Society. We have this courageous board. Raymond Shingoose is on there, Andre is, and we don't get any government money. So we don't really care what they think about us. The Supreme Court decision came down on C92. Some of you heard about that. The Quebec government was saying the whole thing is not constitutional, i.e. they just wanted to get rid of it. Now, the court has found that it is constitutional, but I want to just say to you one important thing. Jordan's principle is in that decision. And that's the first time we've had the Supreme Court recognize Jordan's principle. And that's another safeguard for all of our kids, because that has really become life-changing for so many families. It doesn't mean that it can't go away, but it's just another safety valve we have there to recognize it. And the provinces, like your province, cannot use something called the notwithstanding clause to overturn this decision because it's not in the charter. It wasn't about the charter. So we're good there. At least we dived that one bullet. They'll try to undermine it in other ways, but at least they can't do it that way. Next slide. So there's a couple big decisions that are coming down from the Supreme Court. One is the Dixon decision. That just came down. And that was about whether First Nations laws are subject to the charter. And the Supreme Court has issued this very lengthy decision that I'm going to let Andre talk to you about, since he's got the legal knowledge. The next one is really important. It's called the Dominique case. And it's about honor of the crown, because for too long, Canada will say, hey, First Nations, do you want to take over health or education or social services? We'll sit down with you and we'll let you take it over, but usually on the cheap, right? They know that they're getting a really good deal and they're setting us up for failure. So that's what happened to this nation in Quebec. They were going to take over their own tribal police, and Canada got a funding agreement. It looked like a lot of money to the nation, who had just been scraping by all these years, but it turned out to be far less than what was needed. So this is going to test honor of the crown and good faith negotiations with the funding agreement. So it's going to be really important for child and family, but also for all areas of governance for nations. And it's being heard next week, April 24th. So you can watch this on the Supreme Court website too, right? Spirit Bearer and will be there too. Next slide. So what would I say about C92 is, number one is you have to kind of envision what a healthy child, what is the generation of children you're trying to raise? And then think about what are the pieces that jurisdiction can help us with? What are the pieces we need, that substantive equality, that funding piece that we need to do? And then what do we need to ask of ourselves as a community? How do we change those things so that we truly achieve that vision? And as the chief said, that change doesn't happen overnight. That journey of struggle is kind of like raising a kid, right? It's going to take a while to get right, but you can get there, right? And you will get there. But it's really important to have that guiding light. Some nations have actually developed their own constitutions. So they said, well, let's start with our own constitution, and then we'll know how these different laws fit in. So we'll be able to coordinate education, health, and social services. So that's one thought just to consider. The other is to make sure that you're dealing with those key drivers. Remember those fires we talked about? Doesn't matter how pretty your law is, if you haven't dealt with those, you're going to really struggle. So that's a great opportunity you all have right now, is to reset on all that and make sure that those things are taken care of. Look at that definition of neglect. And there's also a decision on Jordan's principle that says that every child who's recognized by their nation regardless of whether they're on and off reserve, regardless of whether they have status, can get help under Jordan's principle. I think that should be the way of doing business across the board. Why are we still using that crummy Indian Act? I have one of those cards, but I have refused to renew it since 2003. I don't need Canada telling me that I'm a status Indian. My Aunt Thelma already told me that, right? She's a matriarch of our community, and she tells you who you, if she knows who you are, right? But we keep on getting bogged down in this. And in jurisdiction, it can be a dangerous thing. I'll share without identifying the community. They were so concerned because Canada would only fund status Indian people for its jurisdiction agreement. And so it signed off on that. But what happened? Well, before that, they had developed a very holistic model that basically recognizes kinship, family. So some of the children that they were caring for, they had to send back to other First Nations or to the province. That's not the kind of self-determination most people envision, right? So having that straight is really important. And then taking care of emergencies. Man, they're coming at us left, right, and center. We got climate change, we got class actions, we got everything like this. So you're going to have a budget and you know what's happening, but then when something big on the side comes, you need to have extra money to be able to cover that off, right? So that you don't just get stuck with whatever they give you. Next slide. So you can learn more about the C92 decision from these two fabulous people, Naomi Metallic and Hadley Friedland, and of course, Andre. We have a podcast. You can go and listen to that for free. Next slide. And you can watch Elenice Obamsawin's documentaries that actually see the trial in action. We can't make the same mistake twice. You'll see the federal bureaucrats testifying. You'll see me there being cross-examined. And you'll see Spirit Bear, our little bear that reminds us of that this is all about children throughout the thing. And there's also a documentary on Jordan River Anderson, the messenger. Tells you Jordan's story, tells you how Jordan's principle came to be and how it's changed the lives of so many kids. And those are free. You can watch them on the NFB website. So put aside Netflix, Prime, Crave, go on to the NFB. Next slide. And we also have Spirit Bear books, which we have written about that tell the true stories of how all these things have come together. And we have them in at least 2 First Nations languages. And the first book is Spirit Bear and Children Made History. And it was about the tribunal and Jordan's principle, and it's translated into Cree. So you all could be reading that book to your kids in Cree using Spirit Bear and Children Make History, and they're free of charge to download off of our website. Okay? And you're going to be using that on May 10th. Wait till I tell you. All right, next slide. So here we are. Now you see these beautiful bear pictures? Those are animations of the books done by an indigenous animation studio called Spotted Fawn Productions. And these are all handmade puppets and sets. We're actually going to have an exhibit of Spirit Bear and the Spirit Bear animations and everything in Prince George, which is where Spirit Bear is from, on June 21st. And we're going to travel it across the country. And we're going to include sacred things like Jordan's baby blanket. So people can see that these stories, even though they're told through the eyes of a bear, actually are real for kids. Now, May 10th is Bear Witness Day. That's a day to honor Jordan River Anderson and his family. So we would ask that those of you who do spiritual ceremonies, maybe say a prayer or a ceremony for Jordan, we would also ask that you have teddy bear tea parties. And I think my fellow wood dragon there would be a great host for a teddy bear tea party, since it's our year. And what we do is we just bake teddy bear cupcakes. We have like this is fabulous, like this Jell-O that's blue because Jordan's bear was blue. And the reason the bears are important is there's bears in every corner of Jordan's baby blanket. So they come directly from there. And you can watch the animation together. You could read the books together, especially now that I told you it's available in Cree. And just really use that day to get the word out to everybody about Jordan's principle and celebrate Jordan's principle. and get it trending on social media. So even the teenagers can get involved, get it trending, Bear Witness Day and Jordan's Principle. And here's another factoid. In Manitoba, under the previous right-wing government, we actually were gifted by a motion that made May 10th Spirit Bear Day. So it's an actual day in Manitoba, and we want to get it to be a national day too, across the country. But there's actually a Spirit Bear Day Act, and that's an act I can get behind. Next slide. So, big things. Jurisdiction is like having a baby. How hard can it be? You're scared, and then it happens, right? But you know what? What a beautiful, beautiful thing in life, right? And it's also familiar in another way is, and I think about the case this way. It always looks cleaner in the rear view mirror, right? But when you're going through it, it sometimes can feel hard, but you know, you just take it one day at a time and you work with good people and you got good people here and all of you as community members, and you're just going to push it through. And then 20 years from now, your kids are going to be able to look in that rear view mirror and say, man, you know, this, what they did, well, that was really easy, but look at what we have in front of us, right? But you will have plowed that trail for them. You have given them that solid stand to ground to stand on. We're doing more work on Jordan's Principle. We really want to hear from all of you about what it should look like in the long run. I'd like to fill those gaps and those underfunded services. You tell me what you think would work. And finally, I just want to say what an honor it's been to be here with you. And I want to make time for my dear friend, Andre Bear, to share his stuff now that he's back. You disappeared during my talk. Don't think I didn't notice. All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you very much.
I know that that we have a little bit of a time pressure for one of our council members who's also the chair of Eagle Women's Tribunal. But before that, are there any questions for Dr. Blackstock before we continue on?
The audience can hear. By the way, we have about 35 online and about 40-some people here. That's a good audience.
Good evening. First of all, I want to say thank you to George for the prayer and everything. Thank you to those that are online as well. I've been joining all the sessions, and this is my first time being in person. Come to support the Eagle Women Tribunal. Also, my question is for Jordan's Principle, seeing how this is like a new funding and everything is, do you foresee in the long run that it's just going to be like shut off at some point in time?
Yeah, what you're asking is a very important question and always a risk when we're dealing with these governments. That's the good thing about these legal orders. Canada is legally obligated to meet it. Now, we need to make sure that those orders that are adhered to, that's why we're bringing a non-compliance order. And as we think about what long-term reform is, if we're proposing any changes to those orders, we need to make darn sure they strengthen those and don't unintentionally weaken those orders. So we have that there. I would love to see legislation, including Jordan's Principle. And one of the possibilities that nations such as your own could explore is including Jordan's Principle in your own act. Because the Supreme Court has now found that your act has supremacy over federal law. So those are the types of protections that I would look to. Thank you for your question.
Is there anybody online? No? Okay, where is that? Here. Hang on, so the online people can hear the question.
Is every provincial court system, judicial system recognizing and acknowledging our laws regarding Jordan's Principle? And
well, the courts are upholding Jordan's Principle, but you know what? We're still dealing with a lot of judges who don't know very much about our people. That's and I just want to put a shout out to all the indigenous lawyers out there and others and who are out there educating the judges. But I think there's more for us to do. I've been asked by several judges, courts to go in and share on Jordan's Principle, and I go whenever I can. Because the more they know about it, then the more they're going to be able to uphold it and understand why it's so important.
Anybody else?
Maybe the Law Society or federal government or anybody or whoever's in charge of the court systems could get all the judges in line with all the acts new acts are coming out that concerning children.
Yeah, like I would love to see much more education of the court system in general about children. You know, because some of these lawyers who become judges come out of corporate law, for example. And then all of a sudden they're dealing with children, right? And they may have been parents themselves, but they've never applied the law to a child. And I think that's a very different thing. I think we have opportunities here to really think about what type of justice system works for us. And this probably going to mean we're going to cooperate across different groups, maybe by treaty area, maybe by cultural group. I don't know what this looks like, but to set up culturally based courts that actually can really, in a respectful way, hear and make decisions that are in the best interest of the kids in those communities.
Good enough. We have a question back here.
Good evening. Thank you for your time and your presentation. It was very well done. As an individual that works for the Correctional Service of Canada, I'm more interested in your recommendation and your views on how to deal with foster children that graduate into I hate to say the word term graduate, but end up in Dojak, you know, the youth facilities, then they end up in, you know, jail.
Yeah.
So how do we deal with our members that are going through that part of their life? What would you recommend to us as members in helping these individuals? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's
Question.
it's a really important question, and I'm not going to be able to give you the type of answer you deserve. But what I will say is that one good thing we've gotten through the tribunal is post-majority care for children who are in the child welfare care until they're 26. So you might have some young people who are incarcerated right now, and they would be entitled to things like wellness supports, even rent if they were to go back out into the community. Things like driver's licenses, all these basic things that they weren't able to get before until they're 26. So that's a good thing. But what we don't have is for Jordan's principle, if you weren't in care and maybe your family still went through a hard time and you end up in the justice system, there's no Jordan's principle after you're 19. And that has to stop. Jordan's principle should be a lifelong thing. And we should have that level of care, especially for everyone. Your 19th birthday present shouldn't be cutting off all your services.
Okay, a question here. Would you mind introducing yourself?
Hey there, my name is Kristen McNabb and I work for Chief Red Bear. I'm one of the family safety liaison workers. My question is, I worked in the child welfare system for about 7 years now. One thing I've noticed is that there is the inequality for our kinship caregivers, like our cookums, who are raising their grandchildren, family members, and that's very important for our communities to do that because that is our way of life. One thing that I'm just trying to figure out is how come our kinship caregivers are so underfunded, less paid, whereas a foster parent who gets their that lives off reserve, and they get paid and put on a pedestal, and paid so much more and have so much more supports, and then our kinship caregivers. So what can we do in a sense of trying to bring trying to make them equal and having them recognized for the work that they do as well?
Well, there was a U.S. Supreme Court decision, I know this is in the U.S., where that came up to the court. Like, why is it that I, as a family member, get less funding to look after this child than a stranger would? And the court found that to be unreasonable. So throughout the United States, you have to, being a family member doesn't mean you get less money. Jordan's principle is actually really helping out with those families right now. So that's a way of, we've used Jordan's principle a lot to support, for example, elders who are looking after their grandchildren. And you can do it by an individual request or a group request. So you could call it like enhanced families, extended family services, or whatever you want to call it, and put in for supports under that. And as a professional on the line, you would be able to write that letter and probably get support from elders and others to be able to support that along with the First Nation.
Yes, that applies to a lot of us. We had another question here.
Good evening. Thank you so much for coming out here. Seeing you is like going to the same concert over again and I would go 100 times and learn something. You're a hero to me.
Thank you.
So, my question is regarding the Supreme Court and judges and all of the court cases that are moving forward. I'm Chastity DeLorme, by the way, Cowessess band member as well as working for Chief Red Bear. Have you ever thought your organization and perhaps Andre or whoever you work for legally? We all know that the Supreme Court, the federal government, they like stats, they like Western science, they like the facts.
Yeah.
Currently in the research that I'm doing for my master's is on education psychology and how adverse childhood experiences affect your biology. And I know for a fact that there is amples and amples of journal articles and research that will show you out of all of the issues that you talked about today that our children are experiencing affect the biology of our growth from utero 0 to 5 youth into adulthood. And I think that we could win cases using their own tools scientifically, showing that our hormones, our biology is affected by all of these traumas that started from way back when, and nothing is improved now. I know I prayed about this. I went to ceremony and, you know, I have an opportunity to share. And I think a scientific approach might beat them at their own game.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you for the work you're doing. That's why Indigenous academics are so important.
That's
We
it.
actually relied a lot on stats and research studies for bringing this case against Canada. And we also use their own documents against them that we got through access to information. So there was, and I think, but here's a caution about academia, is sometimes some people think that the reason the government isn't doing something is because the government doesn't know about it or doesn't have a solution. In our case, we can track back these inequalities over 100 years. They were choosing not to do it. That means that you need to get the evidence that will convince a court, and you need to bring them to court. And you need to be able to have access to the court. And that's why I would like to see, like the Caring Society, we're very small. We only have 5 full-time staff. But we're totally we totally don't get government money, which means we're much freer to bring litigation. I would like to see something like that in every region for First Nations, so that there is an independent body that can take the litigation forward. Because the problem is when nations do it, they're often vulnerable to retaliation by Canada that underfunds the rest of their programs. So we need to be strategic about having these litigation groups and then skilled researchers like yourself that are doing important work feeding into that. But government doesn't create change, it responds to change. And usually a court notice does the trick.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Thank you.
Dr. Blackstock, I would like to call up Councillor Ira as well as the members of the Eagle Women's Tribunal who would like to make a presentation to you.
Good evening. Yes, we have a couple of tribunal members here, Regan DeLorme and Carol LaValle, if you can please come up. We also have a couple of staff here. Our administrator is here as well, and our office manager is here from the tribunal. And we want to thank you for your presentation, and we want to present you with a small gift of token of our appreciation for you coming to our community. And we're hoping that you continue the work because our reserve needs you, our people need you, and our children need you. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Hang on here. I got to get the bag. Oops, am I blocking anybody? There we go. Oops. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we're just going to take a 5-minute break and then come back with Andre.
Cherry blossoms blooming in the mountain in the early spring. As we walked by the river and she softly took hold of my hand. That's when I fell deep in love with the girl made in Japan.
Give Cindy a round of applause. Thank you, Cindy. That, sure.
If you don't already know, and I didn't already know when I got here, our friend Andre, Derek raised him, if you didn't already know that. Thank you very much. Did a very good job. Our late friend Derek.
Thank you, Uncle Sonny. Cindy Blackstock named her dog after him. Sonny. Dadsan, wag maganti kitam skata na wow kakyo na nask mo ng total yek. I wanted to start it off remembering my dad, and that's the song that I remember. He used to play it all the time. So when I was in about grade 6, I was already taken from my mom, and I was in and out of foster care and struggled with a lot of different things because my mom struggled with alcoholism. And it was Derek and Gail that kind of saved my life and took me in as their own. And I lived with them for, I think, 8 years. So I was really blessed to have this beautiful connection with Cowessess, and I would always come here for the family reunions, and I was a part of their family. So I want to honor, yeah. And the last time I was here and spoke, I was doing Derek's eulogy. And if you remember that, it was sad, but it was actually a good memory for me because I got to share all of the beautiful stories and how wonderful he made us all feel, because he was one of the kindest and most loving people I've ever known. And he was funny. So that was the most important part. So I'll tell you about how I am now and where I'm at. So I'm currently living in Toronto, and hello. And so I'm currently living in Toronto, and I'm working with Cindy and Raymond Shingus on child welfare. And currently my expertise is finding meaningful ways to include our traditional practices within the laws that we make. And this is something that I take to heart because of how I was raised and how I kind of turned out as a teenager and got into a lot of trouble. I was kicked out of 4 high schools until I finally got smartened up, and it was through our ceremonies that I was able to find myself. And so when I started practicing our ceremonial lodges, I was taught by different medicine people throughout the Sundance, the Shake Tent, UEP, Night Lodge, the Sweat Lodge, and I had to follow them everywhere they went, whether it was doctoring people or for funerals and stuff like that. And so I had to learn about what it means to understand the traditional practices of our people and how these practices can help us in the future. Because the way I see it is a lot of the issues that we face today are because of what happened in residential schools and everything that the governments took from us. And so an important part of this process that we're all in together of healing is uncovering those things that were taken from us from residential schools. So thinking back before Canada was a country and while our nations were still here, what kind of things did we do as a people? How did we treat each other? What kind of laws did we live by? And these are the kinds of questions that I ask myself and I try to uncover for our people. And so I work with Raymond Shingus, and I never met Colin Rope, but I basically
have been following his research for the past 3 years and trying to uncover a lot of the truths that he found through this practice of traditional lawmaking. And so this is important because it works in tandem with all of the work in child welfare, because we're all making laws now. And we have to be careful that when we are making these laws, yes, we include minimum standards and this important stuff, but how are we being true to our natural spiritual identity as a people? These are the kinds of questions that I want to uncover with all of you. We'll go to the next slide. So, Wapastim Gauch Dotit Sagastanuk Napel. My spiritual name is the White Horse coming from the east. And it's funny because I'm always flying in from Toronto. But I've done this presentation with different chief and councils across the country, and I've helped train them understand lawmaking as something that is sacred. It's not just a process that we go through to check boxes, but it's something that is sacred because it's involving our children. And whether or not we know it, we're not only raising our children for ourselves, we are raising our children for the Creator. And we are an inherently spiritual people. And this is what I am going to remind you through this presentation. And why this is important is because before we make laws and decide how we want to conduct ourselves and treat each other within our society as a people, first and foremost, we have to understand our own personal individual relationship that we have with the Creator. And that starts with your spiritual identity. Who are you? What is your connection to the Creator? And so mine is right there. And why this is so important, because not all of us have spiritual names because of what happened to us in residential schools. And so what do I encourage our chief and councils and people working with children to do is to take it upon themselves to take that journey and finding their spiritual name and developing that relationship with our Creator, because what we are doing is inherently spiritual when we're working with children, when we're developing these laws. And so this is where we start. Who are we? Our identity, our connection with the Creator. And I invite all of you, if you do not have a spiritual name, to get cloth and tobacco, an offering, and find an elder that you trust, and to go and seek that, because beautiful things will happen when you're able to make that connection to our Creator. And something that I encourage every nation to do that I work with is to seek a way to provide it so every one of our children has a right to their spiritual name. That every one of our children, even if they don't have parents, even if they don't have grandparents, how do we make sure every Cowessess child has the right to get a spiritual name and to make that connection to our Creator? Go to the next slide. Back. So I want to ask you, there is no wrong answer, so you can answer however you want. What do you think the purpose of a law is? Why do you think we have laws? To guide us. Yep. To keep us safe. Yes. Yes. Sorry, I didn't hear you. Reinform. Absolutely. To work together. I agree. Why I ask you this question is because we often get overwhelmed when we think of the child welfare system and all of its complexity. But when we think about law just in itself, generally, what is law supposed to do? Well, law is supposed to keep us safe. Law is supposed to keep order. It's supposed to guide us. And if that's what law is supposed to do, why isn't it doing that right now? Which laws are we following? Why are we following them? So these are the kinds of questions that I want to seek with the communities and the nations that I work with, because what I often find is that one of the key aspects of our nationhood that's missing is our laws. Not only laws that can assert jurisdiction, but laws that remind us of who we are. laws that remind us of why the Creator put us here, what we are given as a people, and teach us how to live in a good way. So we have the Mio-Pamatsuen Act, for example. How does this act teach our children to live a good life, right? So these are the kinds of questions we have to uncover for the community. And I don't have the answers. It's you who have the answers. It's also our elders, our ceremonial knowledge keepers, and it's about having these exact community discussions to be able to uncover these answers to truly determine what we want, how we want to raise our children, not only for ourselves, but also for the Creator. So some of the laws that we follow today are provincial law, they're federal law, there are a lot of laws that are imposed on our people. And the reason why we follow these things is because they are enforceable, which means if we break provincial law, if we break federal law, we're going to get charged, we're going to end up in court, our CMP will get involved. And so these laws are all enforceable. And we know the damage that is caused not only for this nation, but for all nations across the country and in North America, how these colonial laws currently treat or mistreat our people. And so understanding law from this more simple context, I believe is going to help us better understand a way forward when it comes to drafting a child welfare law or a law that's going to protect our children and our families for future generations. So if we look at the laws that we follow today, AKA the provincial law, the federal law, we all know that these laws are not working for us. They're not working for us at all. And so this is something that we have to be able to understand, because if these laws aren't working for us, we have to understand how to make our own laws and how to make them in a way that is going to put our people in a better place. And why this is so special is because for the first time in Canadian history, Canada and the Supreme Court, they're all saying that when you make your child welfare law, you're going to have this federal power. You can overpower the province. And this is an important time in our history, because whatever we put in the Mio-Pamatsuen Act, these things have the federal force of law. And so why wouldn't we put in this act that for future generations, our children have the right to drink clean water, that our children have the right to breathe clean air, that our children have a right to hunt and fish and trap, to be happy, to be loved? Why wouldn't we include those things in the act if you have the federal force of law? Because we know the laws that are in place currently aren't serving anybody. Maybe Canada, but not us. So from my understanding, Nehio law begins before we're born. It's spiritual. We come with a sacred bundle of laws. There are laws that we must follow when we bring our children into this world to ensure they're connected to the Creator. I was meeting with one elder from Niganit, and she had a vision about incorporating into Niganit's law that she wants to ensure that a traditional birthing practice is there for future generations. So they want to put it in the law that the grandmothers have the authority to do a ceremony for children who are going to be born from Niganit. And when they do that ceremony, they're told that spiritually these children are going to receive blessings that they're going to benefit. And so these are some of the things that we're uncovering. And so I do a lot of work with the Yellow Thunderbird Lodge and Raymond Shingus, and all of this information is things that we are talking about and uncovering to try to provide nations with the information that we need to really strengthen our laws. We want to make sure that when we make laws, we're not just following a colonial template. We want to make sure that when we make laws, our people feel proud of who they are. Our people feel empowered by the laws that we create. that we want it to be so strong that when following the amendments of your Miopamatsuan Act, maybe that act should even be taught in your schools. Maybe your children should be taught the laws of Cowessess as well, and that these laws can empower them to feel proud of who they are and where they come from. So children have rights, and one of the rights that I think children have is that right to a spiritual name. There are other aspects, and not all Cree people follow this, but there are histories of Cree people who have family clan systems. And how I know this is because when the Indian Act was implemented, it banned our sun dances, and a lot of ceremonies went underground. One of the ceremonies that went underground that the Cree people used to follow was called Midday Yugamik. The Midday Yugamik is a medicine society. It's a Middaywin lodge. So in this lodge, this is where we would initiate medicine people and teach them about medicine. This is where your clan systems would be honored. And so these are ceremonies and teachings that we've lost along the way, but they're slowly coming back. And I know they're coming back because last summer, I went to my first Cree Midday Yugamik in Sturgeon Lake, Saskatchewan. So these ceremonies are coming back. And in these ceremonies, we have access to knowledge regarding our family clan systems. And it's something that is important because when we think about moving beyond the Indian Act, part of that process means giving families a meaningful role in the governance of the nation. And what that means is the burden of governing Cowessess is not just on chief and council. Like Cindy said, we all play a role in making life better for our children. So how do we ensure that families have a role and a meaningful place in the governance of the nation? I'll tell you one way. I was traveling in the Yukon, and they talked about their governance. So they're not in the Indian Act. They developed a governance model where they have a family clan system. And these family clans, they make the laws that govern the nation. They still have a chief and council, and chief and council can make decisions, but chief and council will follow the laws that are made by the people. So think of it like Canada. How their government works is they have the executive branch. So the Prime Minister Trudeau and his cabinet, they have a legislative branch. So that's House of Commons, all of the members of parliament, and they have a judicial branch. And this is how governments are supposed to work. There's always supposed to be checks and balances on every part. And the reason for that is because it promotes good governance. And so why I'm saying this is because in Canada, you would never see a moment where the Trudeau government, the House of Commons, and the judicial system are all under one government. That would never happen. And the reason why that would never happen is because Canadians would uprise and overthrow the government, right? So if that's not okay for Canada, why is that okay for First Nations communities? The reason why our governing systems are the way they are is because they were built this way intentionally through the Indian Act. So as long as we follow the Indian Act process, this prevents us from revitalizing our inherent traditional governing practices. This prevents us from having families play a meaningful role in the governance of our nations. This prevents us from having a judicial system that can enforce all of the laws that we make. And why this is so important is because every time a nation makes a law, I'm going to steal this. So I'm going to pick on my nation because I always pick on them. But so Little Pine, it's my nation. We spent $2 million developing a constitution in the early 2000s. So this is the $2 million constitution that we made, right? and then we put it there, and then everything was supposed to be better after that. But then nobody followed it. It just sits there. You know why it just sits there? It just sits there because it's not enforceable. People aren't enforcing it. And so how do we enforce it? We enforce it by creating an independent judicial branch, an independent judicial authority which enforces the law that the people made, not only on the people, but also on the governments we elect. Everybody has to follow the Constitution, not just a few people, right? And so this is a critical piece that's missing in a lot of our governments because of what was created by the Indian Act. And it was intentional the way they did this to us. So I'll give that back now. And so why this is so important is because we have an opportunity right now that when we create these child welfare laws, maybe we provide our nations with tools step by step over time, that there is then a pathway to leaving the Indian Act behind. And how we do that is by perhaps within the law that we create with a nation, maybe we find ways to empower families in that law. Maybe we create a system where families now have a say in what laws are made by the nation. Maybe you create your own legislative assembly, right? And the reason why that's so important is because we do not want to follow the Indian Act in terms of every time we make a law, well, we have to hire this company to come and do a referendum, and then everybody's got to go on the apps and whatnot. And then, you know, or we do a band council resolution. So these processes following the Indian Act, I think in my lifetime, they're going to be outdated. And I'm hoping that in the future, in my lifetime, I'll see it, that we don't need to follow those Indian Act processes anymore, that our people have our own process of making laws, that our people have a meaningful role in the governance of the nation. So another example, Little Black Bears Band, not far from you guys, they already started this process. They created a family representative system where each family representative of the nation, it's their responsibility to go out and gain a consensus of how the families are going to vote to pass a law. And so the families themselves become included within the lawmaking process, right? And so I think it's important for us to take it one step at a time and to do whatever the nation is ready for in order to step by step move beyond the Indian Act. So other things that I think need to be included in the law, I'm not saying they need to, but these are just the things we're uncovering. Rites of passage. So a long time ago, before residential schools, a lot of our children had access to these things called rites of passage. And I was fortunate to go through mine at 18, which means I sundanced for the first time. And so these rites of passage, they not only, so when you get your Indian name or your spiritual name, that's like step one. And then step two is going through the rites of passage. So our old people used to get put out to fast. And if you don't get put out to fast, maybe you go through a sundance. Maybe there's women's ceremonies that go through your rites of passage. But basically, it's strengthening that child's spiritual identity and making that connection, because after that rites of passage ceremony, ideally what's supposed to happen next is those children get a vision. And in that vision, they're guided for how they're going to carry out their purpose in life. So we're not forcing our kids to go starve in the bush, but I think it would be wonderful if our nations could provide resources for our children if they choose to go through that process and do their rites of passage. Then maybe we have something within our law that's going to support them in doing that, right? And I don't know about you guys, but what really smartened me up when I was getting kicked out of high school, partying, drugs, alcohol, and all that, for me, it was going through these rites of passage. For me, it was connecting with ceremony, and that's kind of where my spirit woke up. And then all of a sudden I'm here, and working with Cindy Blackstock, one of my heroes. So it's an important part. And I think that when we think about our cultural identity, when we think about Mi'opamatsuin, it's about providing those tools for our children to truly succeed. Oh, where did the thingy go? Right there. Next slide. So this is really funny, and I know it's not by accident, but every time I do this presentation, it snows and there's like wind. And I think the reason why is because when you talk about creation stories, you can't talk about them in unless there's snow on the ground. So I think I'm getting a little bit of backup every time I do it because there's always snow on the ground. And this is also something that's important because as Nehiyawak, our constitution, from my understanding, was Mi'owakotuin, which means we're all related. And this is kind of like our foundational law as a people. And one of the ways we understand this is every time you meet somebody, you ask them, who are you? Who are your parents? How are we related? What nation you from? You're practicing your law. That's our constitution. How are we related? Not only with each other, but how are we related to the land? And why this is important is because from my own understanding that your life starts to change when you understand the world from this context that we're all related. And when we start to truly build relationships with Ogi Sigawak, or the spirit helpers of Creator, things start to change. Things started to change for me. So there's a spirit, his name's Bagakus, and he's a skeleton, but he's like funny. When the coldest of winters were happening and our people were starving and they were freezing to death outside, a spirit had taken pity on our people, and his name was Bagakus. And he told our people that he would help them, keep them warm, and keep them fed if they built that relationship with him and made that offering. And so me and my partner have a sacred relationship with Bagakus. And every time it snows like that, I think about him. And there's this relationship and this connection of love that I have with our grandfathers. And this is the kind of relationship that all of us used to have when it came to our relationship with the sun, Kisikaupisim, the thunder, the wind, the buffalo. These kinds of things are all interconnected within our constitution, which is Mi'owakotuin, that we're all related, we're all connected, because these spirits are our relatives. And these are some of the laws that I was given by my mushum. So my current teacher, his name is Fred Campio. He's a medicine man. He was doing night lodge since he was 21, and he's in his 70s now, but don't tell him that I aged him. And so these are some of the laws that I was given. And these are special things because it's almost like a cheat code that the Creator gave us. If you follow these things, you're going to live a real awesome, deadly life. And it's unfortunate because I don't know any of our children that could name all of these things. And so the most that we do currently is we will put it on a poster and then like hang them up in the schools. And that's fine because we can become familiar with them. But what's key is that if we were to put something like this within the Mi'opamatsuin Act, how do we start ensuring that our children can start embodying these laws too? How can we ensure that we can feel proud of these laws, empowered by them? How do we teach our people that these are the cheat codes to life, right? Next slide. Oh, back. So this might sound complicated, but it's not. All we're doing is we're creating space for our laws to be revitalized. We're creating space for our laws to be talked about. And that's something that I hope I can support different nations to do. And it can be as simple as us sitting in this room and talking to each other about how our old people were raised, talking to each other about our teachings, and having somebody write down those teachings, and then creating a plan to ensure that these teachings make it in the law, and then creating a plan that these laws are going to be administered in a meaningful way, right? So where do we find these stories or these laws? The laws come from our creation stories. And so when we think about, I don't want to pick on Mio Pomatsu Act. So with Ermineskin is one of the nations that I'm working with. So we're now in the beginning process of creating Ermineskin's law. And the first thing that we're doing for the first few months is we're talking about our creation stories. So we're meeting with the elders, we're meeting with the traditional people and asking our people, where do we come from? Why did Creator put us here? What's our purpose in this world? Because these are the kinds of stories that are going to inform and teach us how we need to live. This is our guide. And in order for us to know where we're going, we need to know where we came from. And one of the stories that I was given, and my Muslim gave me the story to pick on me. He's like, do you know why the crow is black? And I was like, no, tell me why. And he was like, well, it used to be white. He said it was the bird that flew the highest in the sky. And he used to pick on all the other animals. And he was really boastful. And he was always bragging about how high he could fly. Eventually, he flew so high, he got burnt by the sun and landed on the ground. And that's why he's black. And he was told, or he told me that this teaching is about humility. It's about not putting yourself above anyone. And if you don't put yourself, or if you put yourself above others, you're going to get burnt. You're going to get humbled. Humility is important. And so how do these creation stories somehow make it in Cowessess law, right? How can these guides of how our elders teach us how to live truly empower us? One of the other things that I was told, everybody look at your fingertips. You see the circles that go around and around and all over the place? It's kind of like a beautiful design. So what I was taught is that our bodies are sacred, and that just looking at your fingertips alone, that design is a sacred design, and that you have the same design in the back of your head right here. And that when you are born, your spirit comes through that right there. And we are so sacred that we can't strike each other, can't hit each other. And so our old people had issues with disciplining their kids because they were told they can't hit their kids, they can't hit each other. So what were they going to do? How could they discipline their kids, right? So one of the teachings that I was told is that that's where Nipsey comes in, or willow. How many of you have had to go pick a willow before? So in our minds, we think about grabbing a willow is just a way to hit somebody, right? But on a spiritual level, when we understand Mi'owa Kotuin, that willow is our grandmother, and she told us that we can use her to discipline our kids, and that when we strike the kid with the willow, it's not just causing pain, it's about the spiritual connection that grandmother is supposed to bring discipline to the child. So there are teachings and lessons that we need to understand when it comes to child rearing, and when it comes to uncovering traditional teachings in a way that can help us live better. Go to the next slide. Oh, I'll keep leaving this all over the place. Okay, cool. So, so this is Pound Maker, Sitting Bull, Big Bear. And the reason why I put this slide up is to help us understand where we come from and our ancestors. And one of the key things that I teach, especially with young people, is for Cree people, Nehiawak, this is one of the stories that I was given about our creation, that in the beginning of time, the first humans that were created were called the Kasei Iwinawak, and that there was Niana Niskwewak, there was 5 women, Niana Napewak, there was 5 men, together there was 10 Kasei Iwinawak, and that these were the first humans that were created. Creator gave them laws to live by. And one of the laws Creator gave them, the first laws, was that you cannot procreate with your relatives. So you can't kiss your cousins. So that was one of the first laws that he gave. And so in order for Kisea Winawak to have children, what ended up happening, how this creation story goes, and this is from Jimmy Ochis, is that the Ogi Sigawak, which means the spirit helpers of creator, the angels, they ended up procreating with the Kisea Winawak, and their children were called Nistameamagan, the firstborn. And your bloodline, our bloodline, all comes from this same place. And what that means is that our ancestors are spirits. It's not figuratively, it's true. The Ogi Sigawak who procreated with the Kisea Winawak was Kisikaupisim, the sun, Xenopiasu, the thunder, Xenoyotin, the wind, Wasquamustus, the buffalo. So those ancestors, those spirits, that's what created us. And so we're related biologically to these spirits. And from what I know and what I was taught is that is why we are an inherently spiritual people. And that is why our connection with ceremony and our connection to the land is stronger than anything, is because we come from it. We come from the sun, we come from the thunder, and our ceremonies are very gifted because of our relationship with the spirit world. And so when we think about who we are and how we govern ourselves, especially when we're making laws, what we're doing is an inherently spiritual practice. And how proud would might our children feel if they knew the truth about where they came from? If they knew the truth that their grandfather is the sun, if they knew the truth that their grandfather was the thunder, their grandmother is the wind, like all of these, this Nehiel Mamtanichagan, this Cree way of thinking was what was taken from us in Indian residential schools. And so when we think about the traditional practices of who we are, it's about remembering and providing space for these discussions to happen so we can remember who we are. We'll go to the next slide. So I already talked about this. This is kind of our constitution for Cree people anyway. And yeah, we'll go to the next slide. So Nehio law is spiritual. When we make our laws as nations, we're doing a spiritual act. And that's why I think it's important that we have spiritual names and that this process is guided by ceremony. When we follow the original laws given to us by the creator, we're challenging this colonial status quo, because from my understanding anyway, Canadian law all stems from the doctrine of discovery, right? And so what better way to challenge Canadian law than through our inherent rights provided by the creator, using our traditional ways of living to challenge those things, right? And so I've been to some nations where they get upset when I do this presentation, because the reason why they get upset is they say, well, you don't know what you're talking about. We follow our spiritual law. And I think that's something that we all need to really reflect on, is if we truly do follow our traditional laws, like how do we do that? And if we don't, how do we start that process? And how do we start enforcing the laws that we make? So we'll go to the next slide. So imagine how our people lived prior to the Indian Act being imposed on us. This means taking responsibility for our own healing, learning how to be independent and self-sufficient. This means reclaiming our natural spiritual identity. And one of the elders that I work with told me that when we create these laws, the best possible outcome is for our children that they start to follow the creator. They know who they are, they're proud of who they are, and if we do the law right, they should be able to follow the creator. They should be familiar with our ceremonies. They should be familiar with our traditional practices. And if you hear the evidence from the leading doctors, psychologists around the world. Gabor Mate even talks about this. The best solution for trauma is ceremony. It's language, it's land. And so these things are key when we think about making laws. We'll go to the next slide. So we all know what happened with residential schools, so I'm not going to get into that. We'll go to the next slide. We'll go to the next slide right here. So why don't we follow this way of life anymore? One of the biggest things was the Indian Act. So the Indian Act is what imposed the chief and council system, the reserve system, pass system, presidential schools, banned our sun dances and other ceremonies. And from my understanding, they did this intentionally because they had to sever our connection with the land in order to take it from us, right? Because they couldn't take it from us if we were like connected with it and it was like we're related. So it's through this Indian Act process that we have to try to get outside of using our laws. So we'll go to the next slide. So what's the way out? We have to make laws. And based on our inherent rights provided by the Creator, within these inherent rights also come responsibilities. So some of the rights that we were given, Creator gave us a right to breathe clean air, to drink clean water, to hunt, fish, trap, and all of these wonderful things. So these inherent rights also come with responsibilities. And so the responsibility that we all have is to ensure that the next 7 generations coming also have access to those inherent rights. So when we make our laws, how are we ensuring that the inherent rights of our children are going to be protected for future generations? So child welfare is an important start because it's our children, it's our babies, it's our future. Looking into the future now, when it comes to Canada recognizing Cowessess as having the federal force of law, your Mi'opamatsuan Act overpowers the province, you overpower federal stuff. And so it's really a moment in time that we can feel really proud of, right? So the next step that I see is if we can have this federal force of law through protecting our children, then the next step is health care. The next step is education. The next step is lands, citizenship. And so it's also remembering that we have an inherent responsibility to protect these things like land, water, animals, and stuff like that. And so the example that I give is in this YouTube video right here. And it's basically in New Zealand, the Maori had given legal personhood to a river. So they basically gave this river human rights and said, you can't destroy this river. This river is our relative. And so what I see in the future is that when we start making these laws, maybe we make laws that protect our land as well, or our animals or our rivers and stuff like that. Because it's really sad. I remember when I was a kid, I used to be able to eat out of the fish basket in Little Pine out of our river, but now it's like so polluted. And so it's unfortunate because I lost that right. How can I practice my right to fish if the river is polluted now, right? So how do we ensure that the next 7 generations can have access to these same things? We'll go to the next slide. This is a really long presentation. How much time do I have? Oh, geez. Okay, I'm gonna try wrap up as fast as I can. We'll go next. So this vision for lawmaking that I'm developing with different nations starts with our creation stories. The next step is to develop a law through those creation stories and then create space for more laws, discussions like this, and implement different systems to make the laws. So like clan systems, family representative systems, and then finally to administer these laws through a tribunal. Oh, back. And then finally, the part that I didn't touch on is enforcement. Okay, we'll go to the next one. So I've already explained this. Most governments have their powers. It's called the division of powers. But basically, most governments will separate decision-making, lawmaking, and then enforcement, the courts. And so the reason why they do that is there's a check and balance on each part. And So the nations that aren't under the Indian Act, so the Niska, the Tlingit, they follow this process to try to promote good governance because they know that the way the Indian Act was imposed on us wasn't our choice. Go to the next slide. So these are the kind of traditional like tools that we're looking at, that we're discovering with our nations. The first is like a clan system or a family representative system to help the nations make laws. And this is to promote the overall good governance of the nation. The next is a traditional court system, which means when we develop these court systems, they should be based on our traditional practices. And one of the cool things that my reserve has in our constitution, but we never implemented it, is we have a court process. It's just like appointing an adjudicator, but we also have a secondary process. And what it is that if the adjudicator can't make a decision, the elders council has the final say. And so why that's important to think about is because we don't have to mimic colonial systems and how they operate in terms of the courts. We can come up with our own better ways, right? We can use sentencing circles and all of that. And then the final part are warrior societies. When we make laws, we have to know that the RCMP aren't going to come and enforce these laws that we're making, right? So we have to develop our own law enforcement practices. And my reserve has what's called the Majane Sak, and the Majane Sak are a warrior society. And basically, they come in every time there's a death or they come in to help with ceremonies. And so from my understanding, if we have this warrior society that's already ingrained within our nation, why not give them more responsibility? Why not train them to keep our people safe, right? And the Tlingit nation, they have warrior societies established, and they have, can't remember, there's an organization in Northern British Columbia that's training them for free to help police their nation. So there's like different options out there. We'll go to the next slide. So we talked lots about clan systems. So not every nation uses clan systems. Ermineskin, for example, through our law development, they don't want to use clan systems. They want to look at societies, they're called. So Crees had different societies. And basically, the point of this is providing responsibility to the nation to have involvement in the governance. So how can you as people or you as families be involved in ensuring that the community is safe? How can you ensure that there is healthcare, education, and all of this wonderful stuff happening in your community? So not all of the responsibility is put on chief and council. For the next slide. Yeah, we talked lots about clan systems. So this is one of the traditional court models that we're looking at. So basically, instead of a court, it would be like a ceremony. And instead of judges, we would have what's called law keepers. And so it's basically people that understand the law of the nation. So let's say Cowessess puts all of their traditional practices that they want in the law. Then you want people that you trust to be able to interpret those laws and enforce them for your nation. And instead of like a competitive process or following provincial courts, it's about creating a ceremony and a space to find peaceful resolution. It might not be a solution that everybody agrees with, but it should be a solution that everybody can live with, right? With the next slide. So the last part I talked about was the warrior societies. And so we're looking at processes of law development where it's community-based. And Cindy talked a little bit about this too, that the solutions to better govern our nations and make life better for our children, especially when it comes to child welfare, it has to be community-owned solutions. It has to be community-driven, right? We'll go to the last slide. No, that's not the last slide. Right here, yeah. So everything that I've talked about and all of this work is guided through ceremony. It's not just made up. And one of the night lodges that I was in and talking about this process of lawmaking, there was a grandfather, his name is He Walks with the Sun. And he told me in that ceremony that when we make our laws, he told me two things. He said, when you make the laws, he said, first thing, they have to be in your own language. They have to be in Cree. That's what he said. And if judges want an interpretation of your law, they said, make them pay for it. Make the judges go pay to get your law interpreted. And then the second thing he said was, when you make your laws, make sure that your laws will bring our people closer to the Creator. Gitam skate na wow, hi hi.
Thank you very much. That brings it to end our presentation. And I just wanted to acknowledge a few people because first of all, Derek raised this young man. I'm so proud of that just to hear him speak today. And I was telling him we used to wander around on the main road when we were teenagers. We were just like 12, 13, 14 years old. And I was giving him some stories about some of the things that we did. But I also want to acknowledge some of the families, please, because we don't know some of these young people here that come here to help us look after our families. And I want them to know about some of our histories. And when he was talking about Colin Rope back in the early 1990s, when I was in law school, Colin Rope was wandering around the hallways of law school trying to figure out ways he's going to draft up these new laws so that they reflect what we have. And it was always such a chore. And over the next course of the next few years, and then I became the chief. And we took over Yorkton Tribal up in the years previous. And now we were exercising some of our I guess our jurisdictions under there. And one of the first things we did, it was this easy. And I know Reagan, I think it was, brought up the idea of our young people in the boys' institutions. And somebody alerted me to us that we had some kids in there. And so I went and they said this one guy doesn't belong there. He just doesn't have any place to go. And under that system, the Yorkton tribal system, I went over there and I went and said, I want to see this kid. This doesn't really belong here, I hear. And that's what they said. He doesn't really belong here. We just have no place for him. And so I said, well, I went and talked with him and had a good talk with him. I talked with some of the other kids too, but I just said, well, went back to the front and I said, this kid doesn't belong here. I'll just take him home. And it was just like that. And we did bring him home. And the family that looked after him after those years is sitting right here. And I still hear about that young boy and his really good role model now. He finished off his high school here, graduated here, was part of us. The other thing that I want to acknowledge is the people that look after their parents. Because I was sitting in law school this one time hearing all men is always getting cut up about how we're not doing things right. So me and Rob Innes, we counted up the number of households on this reserve headed by men who looked after their aging parents up until they went on their journey or they had to go to other care. 9 homes. And I just can remember 7 names right now, but it was 9 homes that we counted. I also wanted to acknowledge that there's many people, many grandparents on this reserve that looked after our kids. And I guarantee if I had $1 for every day I looked after my kids, I'd be rich. And a lot of us would, you know, even with the child tax, if we would have got that. But you know, a lot of us, just ended up holding the bag on that. And it's about time somebody recognized us that we don't get paid for all of that. If they took them away, somebody else would have got paid. But so anyway, I just wanted to acknowledge that the people who care for their parents, the people who've been caring for kids all this time, and the ones that really try. And I'm, like I said, so proud of my late friend Derek for doing this for us. And he's here telling us his knowledge. That's good. All right. It is time for our nightly draws. And if we have our Josh's. Oh, yeah. Are we doing the Eagle Women Tribunal tonight? Are we doing Eagle Women Tribunal tonight?
For presentation.
Are you doing? Yeah, come on up. Come on up. Come on up. Now, anyway, that was my idea for the family. Now we have something else here. We're going to make a presentation, then we're going to do the draws. Josh is just busily getting all the names together there. So it's kind of like a busy bee.
Good evening, everybody. Everybody knows who I am. I'm Carol Valley. I'm part of the Eagle Tribe, Women Tribunal, and I have been in the board and a member ever since it started. And I'm listening to this young man speaking, and I think we're on the right track. I think we're eventually going to get exactly where he's saying we're going to get. I wanted to say something about the spirit and the intent of laws, because somehow or another we're missing to put in maybe a provision on each law of the spirit and intent that's not written in the law, and what it means to us in relationship to the creator and the land. We have to do that when we create our laws here. And yes, we are the Eagle Women Tribunal. We were set up as a tribunal to probably to help our people get along, to make sure that we followed our laws, make sure that the children. And at one point, we wanted, the dream at the time was for every entity within the nation to have a process in their act, in their laws, to include the Eagle Women Tribunal as a dispute resolution panel for all our laws. And that was the original intent of our tribunal. And somehow or another, we kind of got, now we're just into the Male Permission Act. So, but it started with Denise Kaushi when she was in council, but it was a dream before Cadmus. We always knew we were going to get this tribunal going. We just didn't have the legislations or the personnel to work and to develop our laws and to develop our constitution. In one of my terms, the constitution came available, but with the constitution, we do not have the laws and the provisions that guide us further within the spirit and intent of our laws. And we need that. What else can I say? Thank you. Thank you. This is a gift from the Eagle Women Tribunal. We are very pleased to hear you, and I learned a lot from you, and I just within my heart, I know you're doing a good thing for our people. Thank you very much.
Excellent work. Excellent work. If I wouldn't mind some comments coming from online from Clarice Kelly and Michelle Doherty. Clarice says this aligns with the work of the cultural navigator and the language lead. Kelly says, thank you for the incredible knowledge shared with us, our indigenous knowledge. We have many good young and grandparents who are role models. And thank you to Mr. Dr. Blackstock, Andre, Chief Erica, and that comes from our very own Michelle Doherty. And I guess we can make our draws now, can we? Okay, one more presentation. Dr. Blackstock, where did you go?
So on behalf of our chief and council, in appreciation of today and tomorrow, as well as the presentation and the learning tonight, we also have a presentation to Andre as well as Dr. Blackstock. And this always happens, you call somebody when they're in the middle of eating or going to the bathroom. And so apologies, Dr. Blackstock, but we do have a presentation for you. All right, well, that's happening. I'm handing over the mic over to Councillor Joshua to present, and then Councillor Terry.
Thank you, Dr. Cindy Blackstock from the Cowessess First Nation and our community, and for our chief and council. Thank you for coming out and giving us a good presentation on C92 and Jordan's principle. Thank you. Thank you.
Perfect for the weather.
Yeah. You probably used it right away. Someone just came in from outside and I guess there's quite a storm out there. But I'm Councillor Terry Leroy from Cowessess First Nation, your resident councillor, and on behalf of the chief and council in our community, I appreciate you speaking here. It's always a pleasure listening to somebody well-versed like you, well-educated, and what you spoke to us here about the laws, and it's really impressive. One thing that I kind of remember is the grandmother willow. I think it's been used quite a bit on some of us. It definitely works for kids, I know. But I was wondering what happens if somebody like them two big guys standing behind you start acting up, two counselors, pretty big guys. Would it be all right to use grandmother Willow Pickett on them? Yeah, I think that, but anyway, appreciate you coming out, and this is a gift for you from Chief Council and Cowessess community. First Nation, thank you.
And just for the community to know, we will be having Andre back, and we didn't have time because of the storm tonight that's here. And in the interest of getting people up the hill that need to get up the hill on the road, that we will be having other community meetings with Andre as we develop our laws as well. So thank you all for sitting and listening and learning and guiding us as your council as well. So everybody give each other a round of applause.